Now that we have seen the basics of lighting in reality and Lux, let's take a look at how Lux presents the image and try to make sense of some of the controls. When using Lux in reality, you should consider yourself a photographer and assume that you are working with some kind of photographic equipment instead of making the usual assumptions about 3D software. Now, don't get intimidated by this. If you have tried to make sense of the manual controls of a camera before and got confused, don't worry. We will make sense of all that and it will be easy. The good part is that photography has not changed since the first commercial cameras were released. Even a digital camera still works today on the three main parameters: film speed, shutter, and aperture. While digital cameras are all the rage nowadays, we are going to rewind a little bit and talk about film. When shooting with film, you have to select what kind of film you are going to use. This is because film works by a complex layer of chemicals that are sensitive to light. This film of chemicals, called emulsion, reacts to the light during a certain amount of time. What that means is that when exposed to light, the emulsion turns dark. When I say that the film is exposed to light, we need to think that most of the light will come as indirect reflection from objects standing in front of the camera. Dark objects reflect less light, and brighter objects reflect more light. At any given time, exposing the film for a fraction of a second will cause several levels of light to hit the film in different points of the frame. The longer the film sees the light, the darker the emulsion becomes. Now, you probably heard people referring to a camera film as a negative. That's because the image impressed on the film, in other words, captured by the emulsion, is reversed. The brighter the light, the darker a given area of the film will become. On the opposite, dim light will cause a lighter impression on the film. When printing the negative on paper, light is shined again through the negative, and this time another type of film emulsion is applied to the paper. This process creates a negative from a negative, which is in fact a positive. If your head spins a bit at this point, well, it's normal. Pause the video, relax, take a coffee, and think about it until you grok it. Then come back and continue. Given all these facts about emulsion and time to expose the film, it's clear that it's important that the emulsion gets the right amount of light, so that the resulting image is not too dark or too light. If the emulsion doesn't get enough light, your image will be dark. Photographers call that kind of image underexposed. If you let the film get exposed to light for too long, the image will be washed out. That is called overexposing. We might use these terms, overexposed and underexposed, throughout these lessons. So, a film has a certain speed of reaction. If you are shooting in bright daylight, you want a film that is not too sensitive, or your chance to overexpose it can be high. That is called a slow film. If you shoot a night scene or interiors with low light, you want a fast film, one that doesn't need to be exposed for long times to get enough amounts of light. Faster films tend to have a very visible grain. Slower films have finer grain and create a sharper image. In a similar way, digital cameras need to enhance the signal from the photosensor in order to capture more light, and that enhancement can often generate noisy images. Noise is the equivalent in digital photography of getting grainy images, as in fast film. See, I told you that it would not make much difference when using digital cameras. The principles of photography are the same. The speed or sensitivity of film is expressed by a number usually in the hundreds, like 200, 400, 800, and so on. The number is called the ISO speed because it's being standardized by the International Standard Organization, or ISO. Lower numbers mean slower, less sensitive film, and higher numbers mean faster, more sensitive film. Since we just talked about time to expose the film, we should wonder how we control that time. That is done by the shutter. The shutter is an ingenious little device inside your camera that uncovers the film or the digital sensor for a short time and then comes back. Think about it as a curtain that covers the film and then gets pulled aside for a fraction of a second and then snaps back, blocking the light. How long the film is exposed to light is expressed generally in a fraction of a second, like 1/50th of a second or a 125th of a second, and so on. The smaller the fraction, the shorter the time the film is exposed to light, and the darker the image is. So, for example, a 250th of a second is half the time of a 125th of a second, and half the amount of light will hit the film. If you open the shutter for a long time, fast-moving objects will travel during that time the film sees them. This creates those streaks of blur that you can see in certain images. If people move when using a long shutter speed, their image can be blurred. If you use a shorter shutter speed, you get a sharper picture for objects in movement, but the shorter exposure can cause the image to be dark and possibly underexposed. Shutter speed has also an effect on animation, something that we don't bother with right now, but something that we should know and keep in the back of our mind. Here, you see why we need to work with film speed and shutter speed. There still is one more important camera element that is necessary to give you control over your image: the aperture. You know that when the light is bright, the iris of your eye, the colored area, constricts your pupil, reducing the amount of light reaching the retina. At the opposite, if you are in a dark room, your iris dilates your pupil, letting more light reach your retina. When the eye changes the size of the pupil, we don't see any change in the field of view. The size of the image projected inside our eye is the same. Cameras have an iris too, and it works in a similar way that our iris works, by constricting or dilating the pupil, or aperture in this case. When you adjust the iris in a camera, you obtain more control in how much exposure you give to your film. You might have the right shutter speed for a crisp picture, but you need a bit more light to expose the image correctly. Adjusting the iris is called changing the aperture. You can think of the camera as being a simulation of the human eye. The film is our retina. The shutter is our eyelids, and the iris is the iris, which is said to regulate the aperture, the equivalent of the human pupil. The aperture is measured with a very strange number that is called an f-stop. Each f-stop number indicates the size of the aperture. Lower numbers indicate a wider aperture, more light hitting the film, and higher numbers indicate a narrower aperture and less light hitting the film. Here is where it becomes tricky. When you look at f-stop numbers, they don't seem to go on a regular progression. For example, on a typical camera lens, you will see f-stop numbers in this sequence: 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. You can go to any camera store or look at this picture of a Nikon lens and you will see those funny numbers over and over again. Well, believe it or not, every number is half the aperture of the previous one. So, for example, f4 is half the aperture compared to f2.8, half the light. f5.6 is half the aperture and the amount of light than f4. f8 is half the aperture of f5.6, and so on. There is a mathematical reason behind this progression, but we will not get into it. Thousands of photographers simply learn this fact out of practice. And if you are the geeky kind, you know how to find information about the math behind this. Wikipedia is your friend. So if the image is dark and you are at f4, then try f2.8 to get twice as much light inside the camera. After a bit of practice, you'll memorize the sequence, and even if you don't remember, you'll just have to look at the list of f-stops printed on the lens to be reminded. In Lux and Reality, you have the same progression in the user interface. Just remember that each step up generally is half the amount of light of the previous stop. Armed with this new knowledge, let's see how it works. I'll use a film speed of ISO 200 throughout these examples. First, we can verify the story about each aperture stop being progressively half of the previous stop. This picture was taken at ISO 200, 1/250th of a second at f5.6. The same subject, but now with ISO 200, 1/500th of a second, which is half the light of the previous example, and at f4, which is twice the aperture of before. The two pictures have the same exposure as they should. While we cut the light in half with a shutter, we compensated with the aperture. The only difference would be if there was a fast-moving object in the frame. The motion blur would be much less, resulting in a much sharper picture. These controls are used in the linear tone mapper of Lux, which is what we will be using all the time when recording images. Understanding what they do is vital in order to not only get the most from Lux, but to be able to create the images that you want. You may not always want the perfect exposure. Plenty of images have been created underexposed or overexposed on purpose. Understanding the exposure controls is not only about getting the image to render right. They are artistic tools like anything else. You can completely change the mood of the scene by acting on its exposure. Okay, this was a pretty dense lesson. Take a break, think about it, possibly experiment with it if you have a camera. I'll see you in lesson 3, where we will start using all the knowledge gathered here to see reality and Lux in action.